After convicting Bridget Bishop on day one of its opening session, the Court of Oyer and Terminer sat in Salem again today for grand jury proceedings against Rebecca Nurse and John Willard. Welcome to Salem Witch Trials Daily. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. Today is Friday, June 3rd, 1692. The major events of the day are the grand jury hearings Josh mentioned.
The grand jury sat in a chamber on the upper floor of the Salem townhouse. Like yesterday, John Ruck was the foreman. He was the former father-in-law of George Burroughs, a witchcraft suspect.
The afflicted blamed George Burroughs for killing his first two wives. His second wife was Sarah Ruck, John's daughter, and George was accused of using witchcraft to kill her while she was traveling from Maine to Massachusetts to visit her family in Salem.
All that to say that John Ruck may have been inclined to believe witchcraft accusations, as his own daughter had allegedly been murdered by witchcraft. He certainly wasn't an unbiased jury foreman.
All of the evidence presented at trial was new testimony and older testimony, which was read for the grand jury.
There was no physical evidence. In testimony not used in the grand jury hearing but recorded today, Johanna Children testified that yesterday, the apparitions of Rebecca Nurse and Goodman Harwood appeared to her, and Goodman Harwood looked Rebecca in the face and said to her that she did murder him by pushing him off the cart and struck the breath out of his body.
While Joanna's testimony was not used, Elizabeth Hubbard's deposition against Rebecca Nurse was presented at the grand jury hearing, and she swore upon her oath that she stood by her deposition as had been read in court.
Elizabeth claimed that around March 20th, she saw the apparition of Rebecca Nurse. However, the apparition did not hurt Elizabeth until March 24th, the day that Rebecca Nurse in real life was examined by the magistrates.
Elizabeth said, "If Rebecca Nurse did but look upon me, she would strike me down or almost choke me. Several times since March 24th, Rebecca's apparition most grievously afflicted Elizabeth by pinching, pricking, and almost choking her, urging her to write in the devil's book."
And Ann Putnam Jr. testified today that an unknown apparition afflicted her. Ann didn't know her name, but she knew where the woman sat in the meeting house. We know from other testimony that either Ann's mother or her maid, Mercy Lewis, suggested the name Rebecca Nurse.
Ann Putnam Jr. said Rebecca Nurse had been afflicting her since March 14th, especially during her March 24th examination. Rebecca supposedly bit, pinched, and pricked Ann and encouraged her to sign the devil's book.
Mary Walcott testified that, like Elizabeth Hubbard had testified, Rebecca Nurse's apparition began appearing to Mary on March 20th, but did not afflict her until Rebecca's examination on the 24th.
Mary claimed that on May 3rd, the apparition of Rebecca Nurse told her she had had a hand in the deaths of Benjamin Holton, John Harrod, Rebecca Shepherd, and several others.
The grand jury also heard prior depositions and testimonies from the two Ann Putnams and Abigail Williams, who today swore in court to the truth of their accounts.
On May 31st, Abigail Williams had testified about numerous spectral visits from Rebecca Nurse's apparition. According to her testimony, she had been exceedingly perplexed with the apparition of Rebecca Nurse of Salem Village, by which apparition she had been pulled violently and often punched and almost choked, and tempted sometimes to leap into the fire and sometimes to subscribe a book.
Abigail said she had also seen Rebecca Nurse at a witch's Sabbath, sitting next to a man with a high-crowned hat at the upper end of the table. The man with this fancy hat was the devil.
And Rebecca's apparition supposedly told Abigail that she had murdered Goodman Harwood, Benjamin Porter, and Rebecca Shepherd, and her child.
Defendants were not entitled to an attorney and had to present their own cases. For Rebecca Nurse, Clement Coldham, Rebecca Preston, and Mary Tarbell testified today.
Clement Coldham said he had given supposed victim Elizabeth Hubbard a ride home from the meeting house last Sunday, and Elizabeth had told him she was not afraid of the devil. In fact, she could speak with the devil as well as with Clement.
So don't trust Elizabeth Hubbard's allegations against Rebecca Nurse. She's an untrustworthy person who talks with the devil. And Rebecca Preston and Mary Tarbell testified that Rebecca Nurse had been troubled with an infirmity of body for many years, which the jury of women seemed to be afraid it should be something else. They were saying Rebecca did not have a witch's teeth.
All along the way, you can see people standing up for Rebecca. Like, they were obviously taking these allegations seriously and that they were not just.
Definitely.
The prosecution charged Rebecca Nurse with 4 counts of witchcraft for afflicting Ann Putnam Jr., Mary Walcott, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Abigail Williams.
After hearing all of the testimony that we've talked about, the grand jury deliberated on whether there was sufficient evidence to bring each charge to the trial jury.
For each of the 4 counts, the grand jury returned the indictment, billa vera, true bill. They had determined there was cause to try Rebecca Nurse.
Now it was John Willard's turn to face the grand jury. We know some of what was involved in his hearing thanks to Thomas Newton, the Attorney General, writing down a list of witnesses and other evidence against John Willard. The list included Abigail Williams, Mary Walcott, Susanna Sheldon, Nathaniel Putnam, and others, doesn't name, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Ann Putnam Sr., Sarah Churchill, Margaret Jacobs, and mentioned the coroner's inquest into the death of Daniel Wilkins.
Sarah Churchill and Margaret Jacobs claimed that John Willard had tried to dissuade them from confessing to witchcraft.
Sarah Bibber testified that the day before John Willard was examined in Salem Village, she was at Nathaniel Ingersoll's tavern when she saw the apparition of John Willard hurt Mary Walcott and Mercy Lewis grievously and almost choke them. When Sarah spoke about what she saw, the apparition turned on her and tormented her grievously, pinched her, and threw her down.
Benjamin Wilkins, John Wilkins, and Nathaniel Richardson were deposed against John Willard. Benjamin and John Wilkins testified about the death of Lydia Wilkins, John's wife, several days after what seemed to be the healthy delivery of a baby.
Nathaniel Richardson said that he'd heard from a man in Lancaster, Massachusetts, where John Willard had property, that John had once fallen into a profound sleep. This would have been suspicious because witches were supposed to be able to send their spirits abroad while their bodies remained in place. So an unresponsive person could be a person who had done this spectral projection.
In addition to the new testimony, old depositions were read to the grand jury. This included May 18th testimony from Elizabeth Hubbard, Samuel Parris, Nathaniel Ingersoll, Thomas Putnam, Ann Putnam Jr., Mary Walcott, and Abigail Williams.
Elizabeth Hubbard said that John Willard tormented her on May 11th and urged her to sign the Devil's Book. Then on May 18th, when John was examined by magistrates, he afflicted her by looking at her. Here, Elizabeth used almost identical language to her deposition against Rebecca Nurse.
Reverend Samuel Parris, Nathaniel Ingersoll, and Thomas Putnam testified that during the examination of John Willard, afflicted people Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Warren, and Ann Putnam Jr., and John Indian were exceedingly tortured.
The men corroborated Elizabeth Hubbard's testimony about John Willard knocking her down with a look and said that Susanna Sheldon saw the devil whispering in John's ear and could not approach John without falling down.
The touch test was employed during the examination when Mary Warren was in a fit. His touch made her well. A positive result on this test was supposed evidence that John Willard was a witch.
According to a letter written by Thomas Brattle in October 1692, the belief was that witches could transmit effluvia from their eyes to their targets and cause afflictions. This effluvia would be reabsorbed by the witch upon contact with the afflicted person, and that person would be well again.
Another folk test was employed, the Lord's Prayer test. Like everyone else given this test in the Salem witch trials, John Willard failed to recite the Lord's Prayer 100% accurately.
Ann Putnam Jr. claimed that John Willard, who had helped tend to her during her affliction, came as an apparition to her on April 23rd and afflicted her.
Anne stated that John had later threatened to kill her if she wouldn't sign the Devil's Book. She said that the apparition claimed it had whipped Anne's 6-week-old baby sister Sarah to death. Lydia Wilkins' ghost allegedly appeared to Anne and told her John Willard murdered her as well.
Anne testified that she was taken to Wills Hill, the home of the Wilkins family in Salem Village, on May 15th to see the afflicted Daniel Wilkins. There she witnessed the likeness of John Willard afflict not just Daniel, but his grandfather Bray Wilkins and his sister Rebecca Wilkins.
Mary Walcott testified that John Willard's apparition afflicted her most grievously on May 11th and urged her grievously to write in the Devil's Book. He continued to afflict Mary regularly in the weeks since then.
On the 16th of May, Mary Walcott was taken to Wills Hill and saw the apparition of John Willard choking Daniel, who died that night.
And Abigail Williams claimed she was almost killed by John Willard's apparition on and before May 18th.
Unlike what happened in the case of Rebecca Nurse, nobody spoke up for John Willard today. The grand jury indicted him for afflicting Mercy Lewis, Ann Putnam Jr., Elizabeth Hubbard, and Abigail Williams, but decided there wasn't enough evidence to indict him for afflicting Susanna Sheldon, who seemed to have trouble establishing her credibility.
2 indictments against John are missing, but he may have been charged with afflicting Ann Putnam Sr. and Mary Walcott. Somewhat surprisingly, there is no indication that John was charged with killing Daniel Wilkins, though that was the conclusion of the coroner's inquest, which was included in the evidence presented today. And I'll point out that Rebecca was blamed for murders, but you see, she wasn't indicted for those murders too. And I was thinking that when we were reading over that, they were putting that murder out there, but weren't actually using that for the indictment.
In other news today, Rowley ministers Samuel Phillips and Edward Payson testified in defense of witchcraft suspect Elizabeth Howe. They stated that the Purley family had been faking Hannah Purley's illness and blaming it on Elizabeth Howe. The girl herself told the preachers that she had never been hurt by Elizabeth, and they caught her brother telling her to say Elizabeth was a witch.
Wow, what a turn of
Gotcha.
events. Samuel Phillips touched on something important in the witch trials. The identification of witches involved the suggestion of names by others. We know this happened with Ann Putnam Jr.'s accusation against Rebecca Nurse, and many speculate this happened more often, that people suggested names to the afflicted or the afflicted overheard names being discussed in the households. We also seem to see evidence of names being hushed, like, no, not that one.
Edward Payson agreed with Samuel's assessment of the encounter at the Purley home when the girl fell into a fit after her mother was short with her. Hannah Purley never mentioned Elizabeth Howe's name during or after the fit, and Elizabeth herself was present. She took Hannah by the hand and asked her if she'd ever hurt her. Hannah answered, no, never.
In a June 30th deposition, Sarah Bibber reports that John Procter's specter afflicted her today. According to Sarah, the specter did most grievously torment me by pinching, pricking, and almost pressing me to death, urging me to drink as red as blood.
And yesterday, Samuel Gibson arrested Elizabeth Fosdick. Today, he delivered her to the Essex County Sheriff George Corwin to await examination. Then he also arrested Elizabeth Paine and brought her up to Sheriff George Corwin.